So this isn't confined to QAnon, right? This use of subtle and not so subtle discourse strategies to craft a very particular vision of the world. It's not confined to the right nor the left. You can see it in many different spaces and ways. And indeed, it's not confined to politics. You see this in advertisements. You see this in religious texts. You see this in social media posts, all sorts of things. I wanted to share an example from sort of left of center, and that's from HuffPost, which tends to, as if you've ever been to this site, probably well aware, tends to definitely have a pro-Democrat, liberal type of skewing to the site. And so the specific article I wanted to focus on was one that came out just a couple days ago. Supreme Court conservatives plot a liberal apocalypse in 2022 by Paul Blumenthal. Now, the fact that we're saying liberal apocalypse already is giving you a sign that there's going to be some very strong framing here. Apocalypse is obviously sort of a world ending, right? It's a very strong way of framing what's being discussed here, right? The implication is that if the conservative justices rule in ways that they are expected that they might on things like abortion and affirmative action, that would be an apocalyptic scenario for liberalism. So that's obviously an example of framing. There are a few other discourse analysis terms that I want to acknowledge and kind of talk about here that this article kind of does a good job of showing. One is what we call exclusion. One is argumentation and specifically premises, and the third is audience design, addressees versus auditors. So let's start with the third one because it's the easiest. Audience design. So a sort of fundamental premise of a lot of models, I would say most models of discourse analysis, is that speakers or writers or signers, whatever the case may be, know to whom they speak, right? Speakers know to whom they speak, and they often are designing for a specific audience. That audience may not be the only one reading or listening to the text or seeing the sign. There may be also other people, right, who happen to read it. So we have kind of two terms there. Addressees, the people that the speaker thinks that they're speaking to, the person that they designed the piece for, and then auditors, people that happen to be reading it as well, but are not the intended audience. And so it's pretty obvious throughout this article, but certainly in the headline, that there's audience design going on here, as there tends to be on HuffPost articles, and that specifically the writer, right, views the audience as fellow liberals, not as conservatives, right? This would be a very unlikely headline to use if you're trying to speak to conservatives for a number of different reasons, not the least of which is that the idea of sort of a striking blow against liberalism might not sound very upsetting if you're on the opposite end of the political spectrum. This is obviously designed to kind of inspire fear for specifically people that identify as liberal, right? So audience design, addressees. So if other people are reading these HuffPost articles, it's sort of auditors, right? They might be reading it and saying, wow, this article is really not intended for people from my particular political leaning. So it's a good example of audience design. You'll see that throughout as well. Argumentation or premises. So we'll talk a little bit about that throughout, but basically it's pretty clear that the writer views and wants to present various things over the last 40 years as a, quote, decades-long strategy to eventually overturn, as they say, the rights revolution, which is obviously positive framing for certain kinds of things, and then the New Deal order. So they present kind of this whole narrative of things that emerged in the 1930s through the 70s, and then arguing that it's been a decades-long strategy by conservatives since to chip away at that. Whether one agrees or disagrees with that premise, I think it's a simplistic way of arguing the legal history there, but it's certainly, this is an article where they present it in a simplistic way. That's their basic argument, is this has been a decades-long strategy that is finally coming to fruition and will be smashing apart sort of a liberal political order. And so when we talk about argumentation in a discourse analysis piece, you've obviously heard that term before in other contexts. for discourse analysis, part of what we're getting at is that there are usually several premises, one of which is the actual conclusion, and then the other premises are being designed in such a way to support it, right? Exact same thing you do when you're writing a persuasive piece, and you have your, central point and then your several supporting evidences, right? Very, the exact same idea. So in that regard, though, as you would see when you read through it, there are several different premises that get drawn in to support the one argumentation, the one key premise, the conclusion of the decades-long strategy. So for example, one of the necessary premises that they use to craft their idea is that there was essentially a collaboration between conservatives generally, particularly President Reagan, and the Federalist Society. Okay, so that's one premise. Another premise is that people on the Supreme Court, there are 6 justices who we can reliably refer to as conservative, and indeed that's the terminology that's used over and over and over again in the piece. So that's another premise, that Supreme Court justices kind of have one or the other political leaning. There's not a lot of room in that premise for the idea of sort of middle-of-the-road actors or perhaps unconventional justices. So yeah, it's, you see all these different premises that work together, right? And another premise would be that these different policies, one's about laws, one's about abortion, affirmative action, the relationship between state and federal, that these things are all sort of part of a political order that liberals support, right? There's the assumption, the premise, that all of these are things that liberals support, and therefore if they were to be struck down, that it would be a quote liberal apocalypse, which perhaps is a simplified narrative, right? Because there's obviously people, for example, that might vote left of center, but not want to see a reduction of gun rights or an increase in gun laws, right? Or there might be people that vote left of center, but would want to see Roe v. Wade overturned, right? This sorts of things happen. People are complex political creatures. And so it's a simplistic narrative, and it's one where you're drawing together several premises to reach a concluding premise. The final thing I wanted to talk about, and it kind of relates to what I just said, is the concept of exclusion. So I'm going to kind of draw you through this document really quick. I've highlighted in yellow references to liberals, in blue references to conservatives in this article. So liberals, conservative movement, Ronald Reagan. Conservatives. 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 Court's supermajority and its fellow conservatives. So we see several things going on there. Conservatives, 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 over and over again. Notably, they're wrapping up 6 of the justices into that, referring to them as a supermajority, which is not uncommon. But then this turn of phrase, hand its fellow conservatives victories, right? So seeing Supreme Court justices as sort of in lockstep with the conservative political movement. That is not typically how Supreme Court justices present themselves to the public. The idea would be that they stand apart from particular political movements, but of course that's not how we characterize them. We tend to characterize them as conservative or liberal. Liberal. Keep going. Conservatives have enough votes. Court's liberals, the most conservative justice. Sorry. Conservatives. Court's conservatives. One of the points that I want to make with this reoccurring binary of conservative and liberal is that it's an act of exclusion. And what I mean by exclusion, in discourse analysis, exclusion refers to a set of different types of practices in a text. So by a text, we mean whether it's a speech or something actually written down. A set of exclusion, though, in a text is a type of practice or several practices in which you essentially invisibilize or make invisible certain types of actors or beings that you could mention but aren't mentioning, right? So, for example, as a simple example, if you have a wedding venue that has an ad in a local paper, but all it talks about is the bride, and brides should come see our venue and see if they like it, and we work well with brides, and blah, 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 right? It is acting as a form of exclusion, obviously, for bridegrooms, for grooms, right? It's a type of actor that's present in the situation, or at least potentially present, but is being sort of actively ignored, right, or suppressed, as we sometimes say it, depending on what specific way they do it. And you see that here, right? So for one thing, if we ignore Supreme Court justices for a minute and just think about this as sort of a description of an American political landscape, you might ask yourself, who's being excluded, right? Who's being ignored or invisibilized in this sort of liberal conservative binary? A few different groups come to mind. One group that comes to mind is Libertarians, who could be regarded as conservative or liberal on different issues, since they generally hew to a more limited government approach to things. So Libertarians are not mentioned at all in this. Or even sometimes Libertarians are being mentioned, but subsumed under conservative, which might seem like a more natural place to put them. But again, it is sort of ignoring some of the sometimes nuanced differences between sort of conservatives in the GOP sense and Libertarians, who may not view themselves as conservative in that sense. It's also ignoring, to some degree, progressives, or at least it's lumping them under liberal, right? Whereas the reality is that the Democratic Party, right, definitely has sort of, as many commentators have noted, sort of an ideological tension right now between a more centrist, quote, liberal wing, and then a more left of center progressive wing. And so there's the assumption that all of these people can be subsumed under liberal, when in reality, as you've probably noticed on social media, oftentimes progressives don't particularly like the term liberal, partly so, or sometimes some do, some are just fine with it, but others see it as sort of, no, those are those people that are like sort of like far over that direction towards the middle, right? That's not me, or closer to the middle. And then another group that's being excluded, of course, is other types of leftisms other than liberals, right? Certainly we're not seeing anybody referred to as socialist. Certainly we're not hearing anybody referred to as green. Certainly, yeah. So lots of different political positions that don't fall neatly into just a liberal conservative sort of binary, partly because that implies sort of this much piece of the pie when there's other things both further on the spectrum but also lying on different ends of the spectrum, on different spectrums entirely, right, as the example of Libertarians. And so is that good or bad is perhaps up to you to decide, right? I'm not here to characterize this as good or bad discourse. I'm here to suggest, though, that the author is using very clear strategies to try to present a specific vision of the world that serves an ideological purpose in the case that they're making. A final point that I wanted to make before I close this video up is another term called substitution. So substitution in discourse analysis means probably what you think it would mean, which is that when you've referred to something once and then you can refer to it in future parts of the discourse, future parts of the text, by some kind of substitute word. In this case, conservatives above is now being referred to here as they, and so they turned to the courts. Another good example of the fact that this is address design, right? That this is a text designed for liberals, quote unquote. However, the author conceives of that group as a monolith. But the use of the idea of they, right, to characterize conservatives, a sort of othering. More to the point, though, we kind of all do that in everyday discourse, whether or not we're intending to other anything. It's just sort of a natural thing that we do to make communication easier. We don't, and less repetitive. We don't always say the exact same word, right? I, might say, my cat, Smokey, is such a sweet cat, he loves to purr, right? So that is an example of a substitution. We used he instead of Smokey the cat. Substitution in cases like my Smokey the cat example is very innocuous. Substitution in cases like these, we could read something into it, or we could just say it's easier than spelling out conservatives. Substitutions in other cases, it's clear that people use it for ideological purposes when they want to connect two ideas together. So for example, in my own research, as you saw in the paper that you read this week, the legislative ambiguity piece, right? So people are sort of using subjective and religious versus sort of physical and pollution, right? They're using these phrases like kind of interchangeably. So when people use these terms interchangeably to suggest that it's an equivalence of meaning, whether or not it actually is an equivalence of meaning. So people do stuff with discourse. So anyways, I wanted to share an example from left of center so you didn't think I was sort of just pointing out the discursive strategies of QAnon or something. When I recorded some of these lectures last year, was a time period when a number of things were happening in American GOP politics that made for very good examples of linguistic anthropology concepts. But now, writing in 2022, right, there's plenty of really good examples we could point to coming out of things like the Biden administration and stuff like that, where you clearly see discourse strategies sort of being deployed and employed to craft certain kinds of visions of the world. Okay, thank you so much.